And you hear it all the time, especially from the liberal journalists in Austria. Stance. We must now show stance. It is very important to show stance. What is this stance? This stance is the Western transatlantic pro-NATO narrative. That is stance. I actually think stance is to unconditionally advocate for peace. That's what I want. But when stance is talked about in journalism, it actually means echoing the powerful in the West, which used to be exactly the opposite. The reason why publications like Taz were founded in the first place, from the '68 movement, precisely for the opposite, namely, to be a critical medium.
Hello everyone. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies speaking again, today in German, because I have the new editor-in-chief of the magazine International with me. If you have been following this channel in the past few days, you may have seen my obituary for Fritz Ettlinger, the former editor-in-chief and also founder of the magazine, who started it 40 years ago and unfortunately passed away unexpectedly in December. However, the magazine continues, and today I have Dr. Dieter Reinisch with me. He is a historian and journalist, specializing in Central Europe and Germany, where he currently works as a correspondent for various daily newspapers and TV stations, and has now taken over the international editorial management, among other things. Dr. Dieter Reinisch, welcome. Good day, thank you for the invitation. We are on a first-name basis, Dieter. You have now taken over the international aspect in a difficult time, meaning you are now leading the editorial team. Could you perhaps briefly explain to those who are familiar with it, and who might also know the YouTube channel, how things will proceed, especially with the wonderful magazine you have been publishing for many years?
Yes, so the good news is definitely that it will continue. The magazine will continue to be published in the usual manner. So when I say in the usual manner, I mean with political activity, the same line as before, in the usual scope, and with the same number of issues per year. So 6 times a year, 64 plus 4, so 68 pages. In terms of content, also in the tradition as before, so North-South dialogue, peace promotion, multipolarity, active neutrality, these will continue to be the cornerstones. However, there will also be some innovations. A concept was developed over the turn of the year, which was adopted at the General Assembly of the Publishing Association of AG International Publicistisch on January 7th. This includes, as already mentioned, continuity on one hand, but at the same time also innovations, especially in the area where we aim for journalistic professionalization with the international, and also an expansion, particularly outside of Austria, in Germany and the rest of the German-speaking area. So, in the medium term, we want to position ourselves internationally as a foreign policy magazine for the German-speaking region. In the context of journalistic professionalization, an important aspect is that we have assembled a team that not only aligns politically with the international, but also brings journalistic experience. As I mentioned before, everything has been heavily reliant on Fritz, which deserves great respect for his commitment and work. However, there are few people for whom it is possible to invest as many resources as Fritz has. I believe it benefits the publication to distribute this responsibility across broader shoulders.
So, more people in the editorial team as well, because Fritz Ettlinger led this magazine with passion for 40 years, and now you're working on continuing to build it up, so that it's distributed among more people, as I understand it.
Genau, also das Team steht bereits. Wir hatten auch
Exactly. So the team is already in place.
den neuen Chef.
We also had the first meeting of the new editorial team last week. I can say a few words about it. As mentioned, the concept was approved at the general meeting of the AG. I have been appointed as the new editor-in-chief, and there will be 2 deputy editors-in-chief. One of them is Herbert Maurer, whom regular readers of the International already know. He has mainly overseen the culture section and has frequently taken over many of Fritz's tasks. So he has been working intensively with the International for a long time. He comes from journalism, with decades of journalistic experience dating back to the 1980s. And as the second deputy editor-in-chief, Michael Wögerer is joining us.
Zweiter stellvertretender Chefredakteur kommt Michael Wögerer hinzu. Michael oder Mike, wie er genannt wird.
Michael, or Mike as he is called, also has journalistic experience, having worked for 10 years at the Austrian press agency, APA. He comes from what I would now call the left social democratic spectrum, and was the chairman of the Austrian Cuban Society for nearly 10 years until 2023. He is a Latin America specialist, which means he will primarily focus on the Latin America area in the International from now on. There will be a new person assigned to the editorial team, who will take care of book reviews. This is a young historian, also with extensive journalistic experience from Duisburg, who, through working with the book editorial teams and in close coordination with the editorial team, is also being prepared for future editorial roles, if you will.
Chefredaktionstätigkeit werden soll. Und ja, Thomas Lehmann, der bisher
And Thomas Lehmann, who has been doing the graphics so far, will continue to do so. This means that the appearance of the International will remain the same at first glance, so it will remain recognizable. The important thing about a printed magazine is the appearance as an identity factor. That will remain, but there will also be innovations here, gradual innovations. I can say that right away. Only one important person who will be joining is Eva Himmelsstoß, an editor, a professional editor who has been working for many German publishers in Vienna for decades, such as Promedia Verlag, Mandelbaum Verlag, and so on. And she will now be doing the editing, the final editing, before the texts go into graphics.
Bevor die Texte in die Grafik kommen. Und vielleicht kurz noch, vielleicht für die Leser.
And perhaps briefly, for the readers, an important change related to the graphics is that Thomas Lehmann will gradually and gently work on modernizing the graphics. This mainly involves more relaxation, more white space, more images, which also means shorter texts. So the character counts will be drastically reduced. We now have the first issue, which will be published at the beginning of March. It will be released on March 7th. It is also fully conceptualized, and many well-known authors will write in it, and everyone was very active. Everyone said it's good if the texts become shorter, if redundancies are removed, and the appearance becomes more relaxed.
Also es wird das International wird ein
So, the International will be a bit lighter and a bit quicker to read, and the content can also be absorbed a bit faster. But in terms of content, the orientation remains the same. How would you describe it now?
Wie würdest du die jetzt mal beschreiben?
Die Ausrichtung bleibt die gleiche, wie ich schon gesagt habe.
The orientation remains the same, as I have already said. It will be a foreign policy magazine that positions itself outside the day-to-day political foreign policy mainstream. So the International has deliberately not positioned itself there. It actually developed that way due to the changes. But it remains strongly rooted in the tradition from which Fritz comes, in the tradition in which he also founded the International. And that is peace promotion, dialogue. A focus on the Global South, but not exclusively. The focus on the Global South was also very strong due to Fritz's interests as chairman of the Austrian Arab Society, heavily influenced by North Africa and the Middle East.
Sehr stark Nordafrika, Nahe Osten geprägt. Wir wollen von nun an in der Arbeit auch.
From now on, we want to encompass all world regions more in our work, including in the editorial office. This is also one reason why 𝐸𝐵𝐺𝐴 will focus on Latin America. The new issue will also feature 2 contributions on Eastern Europe, Russia, 2 on Latin America, and 2 on Africa. This means finding a possible balance here to truly publish a foreign policy medium that, as I have already said, is also based on the values of the ideologically old Austrian and German social democracy. As mentioned, peace promotion, neutrality, multipolarity. But at the same time, debates should continue to be possible, or perhaps even more so. In the current issue, there is this debate on neutrality with 2 different positions on neutrality, and such debates should be continued. So, it should continue to be a magazine that also provides space for controversial debates on foreign policy issues. This means not only reports on other world regions, but also Austria, Germany, and hopefully more on Switzerland in the future. The foreign policy of these countries, Austrian foreign policy. And what will also be in the next issue, as already mentioned, we want to position ourselves more strongly as a foreign policy medium in the German-speaking area. Regular articles on Germany, and there will be, for example, a contribution in the next issue from a German journalist about German foreign policy after the federal elections, because the issue will be published 2 weeks after the federal elections. And then a current analysis, what will German foreign policy look like after the election results, whatever they may be on the 23rd.
February will look like. And in general, the readership of International can continue to expect that while the analyses are broad, statements like those from Mr. Stoltenberg, that weapons are indeed the path to peace, will continue to be viewed extremely critically by International as part of their positioning. Is that fair to say?
Positionierung, darf man so sagen, oder?
Auf jeden Fall, ja, auf jeden Fall. Das ist der Plan.
In any case, yes, that's the plan, and you'll see in the first issue. There will be a few new authors, but also a strong continuation, a continuity of the previous authors. Wendelin Ettenauer, who has regularly written so far, will write about EU policy in connection with Ukraine, for example. Leo Gabriel, who has written a lot, will write about the role of BRICS in Latin America. Tamara Kamatovich will write about Donald Trump.
Tamara Kamatovich wird über Donald Trump schreiben, George Hallermeyer über Afrika.
George Hallermeyer on Africa. There will continue to be the column on the Middle East by Helga Baumgarten. Karen Leukefeld writes about the situation in Syria from Damascus. This means that many of the previously known authors will continue to be found at International. I was in contact with almost all or very many of the previous authors. There is no author who has not responded positively to the new developments, and there is no author who has said they do not want to continue writing for International.
Das ist sehr schön. Ich bin froh, das zu hören, weil für die
That is very nice. I am glad to hear that, because for the listeners and viewers who are not familiar with International, International is one of the few magazines that has offered asylum to alternative voices and interpretations of world events in the German-speaking area. So, good analysts, good academics, who because these views were no longer in demand, were not published anywhere else in other magazines. And therefore, this alternative and truly peace-oriented approach is, in my opinion, extremely important.
Ansatz meines Erachtens auch extrem wichtig. Könnte ich vielleicht noch deine Meinung erfragen, wie denn du den
Could I perhaps ask for your opinion on how you interpret the media landscape in the German-speaking area, that is Austria, Switzerland, Germany, in connection with foreign policy? In my opinion, it is extremely sad how uniformly in many papers, especially in the daily newspapers, European politics and especially the relations with Russia and China are currently being driven in a warlike direction. Do you see it that way too?
Kriegsrichtung getrieben werden. Siehst du das auch so?
Ja, auf jeden Fall.
Yes, definitely. So not just daily and weekly newspapers, I would say. This clear line that more war is better is basically presented uncritically. I can still remember when in October 2023, the Austrian weekly magazine Profil simply posted an Israeli missile flying towards Gaza and wrote about it. We are at war. We are at war. Yes, we. Who is we? Are we Austrians at war against Gaza? Or are we the Western community of values, as it is always called? Or who is this we anyway? But this we is simply used, and we are at war, and that is good and necessary.
Und wir sind im Krieg und das ist gut und notwendig. Und wenn man sich außerhalb
And if you place yourself outside of this narrative, even if you say peace negotiations are good, then yes, if you say that regarding Ukraine, you are labeled a Putin sympathizer. And if you say that in connection with Gaza, then it's said, well, Hamas started it. Personally, I find that absurd, but also alarming, because we in Austria had the role as a place for peace negotiations and neutrality, which was one of the identity factors of the Second Republic. We now have 70 years of the state treaty, 70 years of neutrality this May.
Wir haben jetzt im Mai 70 Jahre Staatsvertrag, 70 Jahre Neutralität wird auch. Das wird nach in unserer zweiten.
This will appear later in our second issue of this year, in the May-June issue, where these anniversaries and the question of neutrality will be given special attention. And that was what was identity forming for Austria for a long time. And one more thing I wanted to say. The space for peace negotiations, which Vienna was for a long time, with the headquarters of many international organizations, has been completely abandoned. Nowadays, if you look through the media, there are talks that maybe peace negotiations should take place in Bratislava and everything. But Austria's role has been completely lost.
Die Rolle von Österreich ist völlig verloren gegangen und gleichzeitig, wenn du auch heute sagst, ja.
And at the same time, if you say today, yes, why can't Ukraine have a neutral status similar to Austria after World War II? It is said that you want to jeopardize Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. But at the same time, part of Austria's identity is that neutrality actually created this sovereignty for Austria. And if you follow the same argument, I'm always told, you are against Ukraine. You want Ukraine to be broken and dependent on Russia. The same people who previously supported Austrian neutrality.
Dieselben Leute, die österreichische Neutralität früher unterstützt haben.
Kannst du dir das erklären? Denn das ist eine riesengroße.
Can you explain that? Because this is a huge question, not only for Austria but for all of Europe. How we have managed to mentally immerse ourselves in a good-evil, friend-enemy schema to such an extent that any dissent against the mainstream narrative that war is the way to resolve the conflict is automatically labeled as pro-Putin or pro-Russian. This is a very serious ideological entrenchment. I still don't understand it, but you're a journalist too. Have you seen from a journalistic perspective how these epistemic bubbles work? That journalism somehow maintains itself within this ideology, or large parts of it. Unfortunately, internationally, it's positioned outside of it. How is it that so many end up in this mix and keep producing this narrative, especially in neutral Austria?
Wieder dieses Narrativ produzieren, gerade im neutralen Österreich.
Ich glaube, es gibt ja jetzt nicht eine Antwort darauf.
I believe there isn't just one answer or one reason why this has developed. There are, of course, several developmental strands that converge, but I think a very important one is, as you mentioned, when you look at journalism. Journalism is a bubble, and as a young journalist, you want to be part of this bubble. And within this bubble, there is enormous pressure, also through social media channels. So, these deliberate attacks by journalists on other journalists within the social media bubble. If someone writes something different, if someone conducts an interview on a topic where other views are represented, the pressure from the social media bubble immediately arises, as well as the pressure within the editorial offices themselves. And I think the big problem behind this, which I also know from many colleagues, is the precariousness.
Ist die Prekarisierung.
Die was?
Die Prekarisierung des Journalismus.
The what? The precarization of journalism. That hardly any journalist is employed anymore, and hardly any new journalist is being hired. Everyone is almost freelance, similar to the situation in academia. And I know very, very many colleagues who also work for public broadcasting who say I see it differently. But I can't say that. Otherwise, I won't get any more assignments. And there are also many examples, including from Austria, of people who no longer receive assignments, especially since February 24th, and again since October 7th, 23, meaning Ukraine, Gaza.
Dann nochmal seit dem 7. Oktober 23, also Ukraine, Gaza. Ich meine, öffentlich-rechtlicher Ö1, da ist mehr als die Hälfte.
Public broadcaster O1, where more than half of the content is produced by freelancers for very low fees. These people live from one broadcast to the next, and when the pressure becomes too strong, or even the fear itself, what I see very strongly is self-censorship. From the outset, I'd rather not report anything about Ukraine than say something wrong and not get any more assignments. So this self-censorship, and I believe this is all very closely related to the increasingly tight economic constraints of journalism.
Enge des Journalismus zusammen. Nicht nur Journalismus, ich sehe in anderen Bereichen auch in der Wissenschaft ja genauso.
Not only in journalism, but also in other areas, such as science. You see the same thing, where critical science simply has fewer and fewer resources. And sometimes other European countries look a bit enviously at Switzerland, where the Swiss National Science Foundation apparently has more resources than in other countries. From Switzerland, people probably also think there are too few resources. But at the same time, people in Austria always look a little enviously at Switzerland. And as a result, the corridor of opinion becomes very narrow.
Verengt sich halt der Meinungskorridor sehr stark.
Also wir haben es eigentlich geschafft, ein System zu bauen.
So we have actually managed to build a system. And I mean, this is also repeating itself in Germany. It repeats itself in other states, where this gig economy, which has developed over the last 10-15 years, plays into this spiral where the bubble behaves more coherently, so more uniformly, and then marches in one direction, so that a synchronized step is achieved. More than before, when journalists were still permanently employed and had a bit of job security and could also take some risks.
Sicherheit hatten und sich auch mal aus dem Fenster lehnen durften.
Ja. Auf jeden Fall.
Yes, definitely. And that's the problem later on in small countries like Austria and Switzerland, where it becomes more difficult to find alternative ways to make a living. Of course, there are alternative ways to publish, but you can't make a living from them because the fees are extremely low, and it becomes increasingly difficult to generate a reasonably decent monthly income to pay your bills. Naturally, it's somewhat easier in Germany. A well-known example is Patrick Barth, who worked for a long time for SWR and NDR. He reported a lot from Eastern Europe, was in Eastern Ukraine, was in the Donbass, reported from there, and didn't position himself on one side, but tried to bring reports from both sides.
Versucht Reportagen eben von beiden Seiten zu bringen. Eines seiner Bücher heißt ja auch auf beiden Seiten der Front. Naja, und bekommt
One of his books is also called On Both Sides of the Front. Well, and now he no longer receives assignments from the major media, the leading media, mainstream media, or public broadcasting. He is in the fortunate position that Germany is a huge market. This means that a person like him still finds success. He publishes great books with West End Verlag and writes for various media that still accept his reports. But that's also due to the large market. In smaller countries like Austria, it's much more difficult, where there isn't an alternative market of that size.
Wo es halt diesen alternativen Markt in der Größe nicht gibt.
Das ist eine wichtige Beobachtung auch, dass wir sind nicht an einem
This is an important observation that we are not at a point where alternative opinions can no longer be expressed. You can express them, but then you are ostracized by the system, or rather by the machinery. This is a relatively organic process, and I still wonder how we can best rid ourselves of it. Because interestingly, that's why YouTube channels like this one work, as there is a need for reporting that aligns with the reality of international politics, or, in the worst case, the reality of the battlefield.
Des Schlachtfeldes im schlimmsten Falle ausrichtet, ist da. Leute wollen wissen, was passiert, währenddem diese
People want to know what's happening, while this epistemic journalist bubble leads to simply ignoring everything that's not approved, and sometimes spreading nonsense for months. Like, yes, there are 20,000 North Korean soldiers in Ukraine, of which not a single photo exists, but it's just assumed and cut out because that's the good opinion. This stance journalism also leads to a detachment from reality, but the audience's need for reality is still there. Do you feel that this will be resolved? And do you see cracks in this increasingly narrow corridor of journalistic opinion, or will it intensify?
Im journalistischen Meinungskorridor oder wird sich das verstärken?
Sowohl als auch. Ich glaube, es wird sich weiterhin verstärken.
Both. I believe it will continue to intensify because the political situation and contradictions are also escalating. The geopolitical situation is escalating. The significance of Europe is declining, and as a result, it will intensify. I believe the conflicts will also escalate, both geopolitically and in the media landscape. But at the same time, I think the process of dissolving this is also unstoppable, because due to this escalation in the media landscape, only one opinion is present, only one opinion is allowed or presented. As a result, a huge number of people are turning away from traditional media. Fewer and fewer people are consuming them because they no longer see their interests and perspectives reflected or no longer believe that objective reporting is taking place.
Der Meinung sind, dass hier objektiv berichtet wird. Das ist ja ein ähnlicher Prozess, den man schon früher.
This is a similar process that began earlier with the turning away from politics and political parties. There are different terms that can be used for this. Last year, I reviewed a book translated into German by Pro Media Verlag, which I referred to as post-politics. But there are different terms for this process, this turning away. For a long time, it was attempted to explain this as a depoliticizing population. But I don't see it as a depoliticizing population, because in part, it is also a conscious political act, the turning away from politics itself as a political act. Exactly, or I wouldn't even say turning away from politics, but rather turning away from party politics.
Weil auch wenn man sich ja anschaut, in Österreich.
Because if you look at Austria, 80% of the population, according to the last survey from the fall, are in favor of maintaining neutrality and against closer ties to any military alliance. Similarly, in October and November, a large study by Der Spiegel was published. Der Spiegel, which loudly proclaims how much military support is needed for Israel and Ukraine. Every week there's something on the cover about this. And it talks about arms deliveries to protect our values and freedoms, and more war so that we can live peacefully in Germany, and so on. And then this large Spiegel study comes out, where almost 70% of respondents say they are against arms deliveries.
Der Befragten sagen, sie sind gegen Waffenlieferungen. Das heißt,
This means that even this constant promotion of a position no longer works. And in Austria, there is no party that openly advocates for neutrality. We have a few parties like the Social Democrats who say nothing anymore, and the ÖVP, which somehow also tries to avoid the issue. Then we have the smaller parties that openly say, well, neutrality protection against Putin is not an option. And if we don't soon actively participate in the EU battle groups or NATO, then Putin will be at Vienna's doorstep in a few weeks. This is also openly stated by parts of the Greens and the liberal Neos. And yes, currently the FPO is already trying to position itself as a defender of neutrality.
So your right-wing party, your right conservative party.
Genau. Als Verteidiger der Neutralität.
Exactly. To pose as defenders of neutrality. But I say pose because historically the FPO was actually the pro-NATO party. So until the early 2000s, it was clearly the pro-NATO party. At that time, the position of the ÖVP, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, was to maintain neutrality, and the FPO was against it. The classic supporters were against the position of these parties. Fritz Edling also repeatedly mentioned in his interviews that until the early 2000s, the FPO was the pro-NATO party. Now the other parties have abandoned this clear position, whereupon the FPO jumped on this bandwagon. And it works. It is credible for many of the voters. I'm not saying it's credible because they have made so many shifts in their history.
aber eine durchgehend klare Position.
But a consistently clear position that reflects what the population wants, as shown in the polls, is not represented by any of the parliamentary parties. Not a single one. And these are very similar developments. You mentioned at the beginning that I did my doctorate on the Northern Ireland conflict, lived in Ireland for a long time, still follow the political debate in Ireland very intensively, and am still there. And actually, it's almost exactly the same in Ireland with the question of neutrality, and also with the population, according to polls by the Irish Times. So the Irish Times, which is the major quality newspaper in Ireland, did something very interesting. It immediately shifted to a war course after July 22nd.
Nach dem 22. Februar mit, ja, wir müssen jetzt alles tun, was nur...
In February, yes, we must do everything possible to support Ukraine militarily, and we published weekly surveys on how the population viewed this. And then, a year and a half later, still 80% of the population was against arms deliveries, against military assistance from Ireland to Ukraine, only wanting to send humanitarian aid and nothing else while maintaining neutrality. That was still the result of the Irish Times survey after a year and a half, after which they stopped it. So these weekly. So now there are no more surveys since summer. I think at some point in 2023, the Irish Times then, it was a bit like, okay, it's pointless. It's still 80%, different from what we write. Let's leave it. And now there are no more surveys.
Lassen wir's. Und es gibt keine Umfragen halt mehr.
Also das macht mir eigentlich Mut, auch dass
That actually gives me hope that there is a significant portion of the population who intuitively understands that war is not the path to peace, but rather dialogue and diplomacy. However, it is quite interesting that in this case we are currently in Europe, whether neutral or not, essentially in a process where politics poorly reflects and filters the opinions and spectrum of views of the population upwards.
Aber schlecht widerspiegelt und schlecht filtert nach oben. Und das zu kompensieren, dann der Journalismus...
And to compensate for this, journalism similarly begins to paint a dreamlike picture of reality to support certain political processes. However, this ultimately reveals more and more the dissonances, or rather this incoherence, because a good portion of the population sees that their own opinion, or these 80%, are neither reflected in politics nor in the media, and that in doing so, politics and media are essentially digging their own grave. The simple question is whether the political grave comes first, or the grave from a nuclear strike, which we are moving towards.
Genau, da gebe ich dir, genau, das sehe ich genauso wie du.
Exactly. I see it the same way as you do. And that brings us back to your original question. Namely, I believe there will be a tightening, also a narrowing of the corridor of opinion due to the escalation of conflicts, which will intensify not only on a geopolitical level, but also within the parties and the media. And this is precisely what leads to a further turning away from the media. That means, as you say, they are essentially digging their own grave. And you can already see the processes advancing. Especially the publications that once described themselves as left liberal are in enormous crisis.
In einer enormen Krise, ja. Also die Auflagenzahlen der Taz zum Beispiel, ja. Ich kann mich noch erinnern, die Taz.
The circulation numbers of the 𝐾/𝐍, for example. I can still remember, in February 2022, the 𝐾/𝐍 simply had a huge Ukrainian flag on the front page, without any commentary. And this already brings up that famous word you mentioned, which I find very problematic. Stance. We have to show stance. And you hear it constantly, especially from the liberal journalists in Austria. Stance. We have to show stance now. It's very important to show stance. What is this stance? This stance is the Western transatlantic pro-NATO narrative. That's stance.
Das ist Haltung. Ich finde eigentlich, Haltung ist bedingungslos für Frieden.
I actually think that taking a stance means unconditionally advocating for peace. That's what I want. But when stance is talked about in journalism, it means echoing the powerful in the West, which used to be exactly the opposite. The reason why publications like Taz were founded in the first place, from the '68er movement, precisely to be a critical medium. But those who have swung the most towards supporting war are the ones we now see most in crisis. And Taz has already announced that it will also cease its print edition.
Und die Taz hat ja bereits angekündigt, ihre Druckauflage auch einzustellen.
Aber eben ich schmunzle oder ich lache eigentlich.
But indeed, I smirk, or actually laugh, because it is sad, and also very dangerous, and it is not a good situation we are in. But the fact that these newspapers then constantly talk about us going through difficult times, and now supporting quality journalism, and then shifting the blame to digital developments, and people who no longer inform themselves as they should, that these people lack the intellect to realize that it is their own change, their own inability to look at the whole system, that then develops a counter-narrative to justify their own failure. That amuses me, but we suffer greatly from it.
Ja, wir leiden darunter stark, aber ich verstehe schon. Also
Yes, we suffer greatly from it, but I do understand. So yes, when you say it amuses you, yes, we suffer greatly from it, but it also amuses me very often. And sometimes you only have the chance to take the whole thing with a bit of humor, because the situation might already be so difficult. Even if we take it with humor, we probably couldn't have imagined a few years ago that we would find ourselves in a situation like the one the world is currently in. And there have been many other difficult situations. And I just think, I'm glad that the politicians who are in charge today weren't in charge during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because it certainly wouldn't have been resolved peacefully then.
Weil dann wäre sie sicher nicht friedlich gelöst worden.
Bin ich absolut mit dir einverstanden und ich bin froh.
I absolutely agree with you. And I'm glad that you exist, that International exists, the magazine, that there is an alternative public sphere, that we can also spread this alternative public sphere on social media and in print. Where can one subscribe to International? Where should people go to get a subscription?
Sich da ein Abo zu holen?
Ja, am besten sind Abos natürlich, weil die
Yes, subscriptions are of course best because they enable the long-term financing of International. The easiest way is on the homepage international.org.at, and there is a menu item for subscriptions at the top right of the screen in the menu bar, where you can order a subscription. There are different options, starting at €40 for print. There are also digital subscriptions, €40 for print for 1 year, which is a very affordable price for domestic, a bit more for outside of Austria due to shipping costs. What we also have for supporters, and this probably helps us the most at the moment, is that due to this new concept and new setup, costs naturally arise for us. One-time costs like office relocation, new online presence. So to also put us on a healthy financial footing in the long term, we have set up the option of sponsorship subscriptions.
Eingerichtet und ein Ziel der Förderabos ist es.
And one goal of the subscription funding is to pay authors who write for us market standard fees in the future. Although I say market standard, the market is currently very small. We cannot afford high fees, but we want to regularly pay authors fees, which has not always been the case so far. Precisely for the reason you mentioned at the very beginning, these were authors who otherwise have no opportunity to publish because the range of opinions has become so narrow, because their critical opinions no longer find a publication platform in the German-speaking area. To give them an opportunity to continue writing, to continue receiving fees, at least to some extent, to be able to live from it, and not have to give up their critical journalistic work. So with part of the funds from the sponsorship subscriptions, we also want to provide support, especially for young authors. Hopefully starting next year, the goal is that we might also be able to make larger investments in research. For example, if an author travels to a region of the world that is otherwise not reported on in the German-speaking area, we can finance research trips. So that is the goal of the sponsorship subscriptions. With the sponsorship subscriptions, you are supporting exactly this critical journalism that we have been talking about, which is becoming increasingly difficult to promote in the German-speaking area.
den echten kritischen Journalismus,
The real critical journalism, the kind of journalism that questions itself and doesn't just parrot mainstream pro-war propaganda. Ladies and gentlemen, support the magazine international.or.8. We do too. Dieter Reinisch, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for the invitation.
Vielen Dank für die Einladung.